Hello everybody, welcome back to another video lesson for 6th grade history. Today's topic is going to be the final part of our revolutionary events, part 3 of 3. So of course, if you are missing parts 1 or 2, I would suggest that you pause this video, go back and watch the earlier parts to make sure everything has been filled in, and then you can move on with today's lesson. If you are ready to go, though, why don't we just jump right into it? Today's topic is going to be the last 3 major events of the American Revolution. We've already covered, I believe it was 4 or 5 of them in part 1. Then we covered the Declaration of Independence in part 2. And then, of course, we have our last 3 in part 3 here. So why don't we just jump into it? Not too long after the signing of the Declaration of Independence, which, if you remember, was July 4th, 1776, we have the Battle of Saratoga, and that takes place during the fall of 1777. So it's about a year after the last major event of the war. It was at this point, guys, that the Continental Army was struggling, okay? They are not really doing too well. They're running out of supplies, they are running out of soldiers, and they are running out of patience and, just drive and motivation to keep this fight going. You gotta think, what happens during the fall and during the winter? It gets very cold, it gets very snowy, and without the proper supplies, a lot of these Minutemen from the Continental Army were falling sick and dying because not of war-related wounds, but because the cold was getting to them, or because they were catching a disease because of it and getting sick. So there was a lot of issues going on with the Continental Army at this point in the war. The British are trying to come south from Canada to divide the Patriot Army. So you've got some British who are already in the southern area of the colonies who are fighting the Patriots from below. Then, of course, you have a second fleet who is coming in from the top, from Canada. If you know, Canada's our neighbor to the north up there. And they're going to come south and try to make it so that the Patriot Army has to fight on what we call 2 fronts. So you would have your southern front where they're fighting the British troops who are stationed down there, and then they would have to bring part of their troops up north a little bit farther to fight the advancing British coming down from Canada. Well, they do just that, and the Colonial Army meets them in the city of Saratoga, which is actually in New York State. It's a little bit far away from where I am from. It's up in the Adirondack Mountains, but they meet in Saratoga. The Colonial Army, though, they end up winning. So remember the Battle of Bunker Hill when we lost, but it gave us motivation? Well, the Battle of Saratoga, we win, and it gives us even more motivation. And we win by using new war strategies. So they begin to shoot Native American scouts first. The British were in cahoots with the Native Americans and were using them as spies and as guides through the terrain that they were unfamiliar with, because the Native Americans knew their way around the land better than anyone else did. So the Patriots knew that if they took out the eyes of the troops, figuratively speaking, then the troops wouldn't know where to go or where the Patriots were hiding. After that, then the British officers started to go down because, again, the officers are the leaders. So if you take out the leader of the troops, well, then the rest of them have no direction and no idea what to do. So you get Native American scouts being shot and killed first, and then British officers following not too far behind. This victory is considered a turning point in the war, ladies and gentlemen. Do you remember our person, Marquis de Lafayette, that we talked about from our Revolutionary People's Notes? If you remember him, you'll also remember that one of his key phrases that we picked out for that study guide is that he worked with the King of France, all right, and more specifically to get troops and weapons and ships over to the colonies to help the Patriots fight. It is this battle, ladies and gentlemen, the Battle of Saratoga, that proves to the King of France that it is going to be worth his time to send his men and to spend the country's money on helping the Americans defeat the British, okay? This is going to be very, very, very important. Without the French help, guys, there is no possible way that we would have been able to win the Revolutionary War. They were kind of the kick in the pants that we needed to get ourselves motivated again and get ourselves back on the battlefield and fighting the British for our independence once again. So there you go, guys, the Battle of Saratoga, our big turning point in the war. That brings us, ladies and gentlemen, 4 years later, Now, I'm not saying that there were no battles at all during those 4 years, but the next major battle comes on October 19th, 1781, and it is known as the Battle at Yorktown. Of course, ladies and gentlemen, we are referring to Yorktown, Virginia, which is not too far south of us here in Caroline County. And at Yorktown, the British Army, which of course is led by Lord Cornwallis, found themselves trapped by the Continental Army in the north and our good friends, the French troops at sea. So they brought their boats over and weren't allowing the British to escape onto their ships and leave the battle in order to save whatever they had left. So they're kind of pinned between what we'll say a rock and a hard place. They've got the Patriots right here. They've got the French right here. They're stuck in the middle with absolutely no option except to either surrender or to get slaughtered and keep fighting. This is the battle that Cornwallis eventually surrenders to Washington, though, and ends the fighting in the Revolutionary War. Cornwallis realized at this point, with French help, there's nothing that we can do, and we might as well cut our losses and give the colonies their independence. Now, of course, they didn't think that they would last very long, and they figured, hey, we'll probably have control of these colonies by the end of the decade. Unfortunately for the British, though, America becomes a successful country, and they don't get control over us again. So now that the fighting is over, ladies and gentlemen, you might think that the war is over, but there is one more major event that we have to talk about, which is going to tie up all of the loose ends that were left from the original battles. This happens 2 years after the end of the war, after the Battle of Yorktown in 1783, and it is called the Treaty of Paris, okay? So 2 years after the surrender of Cornwallis at Yorktown, Benjamin Franklin is our representative of the United States, and he goes over to France, to Paris, France, to have formal peace talks with the British. Now, you might think, why are they going all the way to France to have these peace talks? And why aren't they doing it in America or in Great Britain? Well, they needed a neutral place that really wasn't a huge player, besides the help that they were giving the Patriots, to hash out the details of the agreement moving forward. There are going to be 2 major points, though, that you need to know about the Treaty of Paris. Again, this isn't all that was contained in there, but there are 2 major points that you need to know. First and foremost, and this is probably the most important outcome of the Treaty of Paris, is that England recognizes American independence. Guys, for one country to recognize another country as being free, as being in their own country, is huge, okay? Especially if that other country used to have control over the new nation. So England recognizing American independence only 2 years after the end of the war is actually a pretty big step in the right direction to getting respect from other nations around the globe as well. The second outcome is that America gains land. America gets the land between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River, okay? So we actually double the size of the United States. And of course, I'll put a map up there to show you guys what that looks like. But this is huge in growing the U.S. and actually fuels some of our thoughts to spread across the continent, which is something that we will be covering in the unit after the American Revolution. But ladies and gentlemen, again, that is it for our video today. We only had 3 events to wrap up with, so please check over your note sheet, make sure everything has been filled in correctly, and when you are done, you can rejoin us in the conference.